Hi everyone, I'm Adam Steele for Hot Pole Studios, and today we're taking a look at Positive Grid's Bias Amp 2.
Yep.
So when Bias first came out, it came out on the iPad, and compared to anything else that there was at all for the iPad in terms of guitar amps, it was a revelation. It was night and day. It was brilliant. And then along came Bias Effects, which had all the kind of tube screamers and delays and reverbs and stuff. Then Bias Amp and everything started to come out on the desktop, and I have to say, I wasn't particularly enthralled because it didn't seem to fit my workflow. The sounds I was getting weren't quite at the time what I was looking for. However, now Bias Amp 2 has come out, and I have to say the difference is brilliant. Some of the new features in there are really my cup of tea, like the bass amps, the new types of tubes, the dynamic tone thing where it makes everything a bit less grainy and static and a bit more breathing life into everything. And particularly my big thing is the cabinet. The cabinets were never there for me, but with the new Celestion cabinets, they've had a partnership between Positive Grid and Celestion. The Celestion cabs there are incredible. And you may have seen my channel with me reviewing some of the Celestion Plus stuff before. And as far as virtual cabs go, it's really up there. And it's really made me hear Bias in a whole new light. And so some of the tones that we've got today, I used a tube screamer in front of my DI box. What I've been using is a Boo Instruments tube screamer, which is essentially an 808, it's a Maxon 808, Ibanez 808, into a Groove Tube's tube DI box, which is essentially just a really good DI box, into the Audient ASP 800. Not into one of the two super channels, just into one of the regular plain old clean channels. And the tube screamer, I've found I like using a tube screamer with heavy sounds to get more of a drive. That's not a slight on Bias Amp at all, because what I would do with a real amp is exactly the same thing. So that's not comparison. And bias effects, as I've not used today. I've just used bias amp as the amp. So we'll go through and I'll show you what I've done with some of these guitar sounds, because some of them I've almost gone with the stock sounds. Some of them I've really customized them, and I've kind of mixed them with a bit of EQ, bit of compression, bit of reverb, which is exactly what you would do, because bias amp is just an amp head and a cabinet and is not the rest of the mix. So even with the best real guitar amps in the world, I would still mix them. So I've done exactly here what I would with a real guitar amp, and I have to say it sounds like a real guitar amp, which, what more can I ask for? So let's dive in now. Let's turn around, and I'm going to spin around, run a different camera, and show you exactly what we've done. So now that we've demonstrated our song to you, let's have a look at some of the tones that we got, and specifically how we got them. The blues solo, let's have a look at that. So for me, it's quite a low gain sound. I usually tend to like something that's got more grit, but I wanted to do a bit of a demonstration of something that was a bit more in that kind of cleany, almost country-ish territory. In the mix, this had Joey Sturgis's gain reduction, which is just a compressor plug-in afterwards. Then a bit of EQ from the Slate Everything bundle with a bit of a top boost, bit of a mid push, and a bit of a low cut and high cut. Nothing crazy, but this is exactly what I would do with the real guitar amp equivalent to make it fit in a mix. So having turned them off so we can hear... Also, let's turn the reverb off, because bias amp doesn't have it does have inbuilt reverb, but I wasn't using it. Let's just add a little bit of theirs. Maybe a rich plate, just to a small level. Just push it up. Yeah, so I happen to have a reverb already in the mix, which I used, but it's a perfectly functional reverb that's in bias amp. But the blues model is quite interesting. The preamp is a little simpler than the... So that's the standard one with a lot of knobs going on. The blues one has a lot of them missing because it's a completely different circuit design. You can see from this draw here that it's a different setup, different capacitors and things. So you can choose between 1 or 2 tube stages. You can add a top boost in front of the amp, which if you're doing a voxy kind of thing, that's right there for you. The gain is exactly what it suggests, and that would go on your custom front panel. The cathode tubes are pushed, and there's a fat boost button, which I've taken advantage of. The 12BH7, I think, is a new tube type for bias amp. Drives large amounts of current, perfectly controls distortion level without volume loss. I may be using that in the wrong place, but it sounded quite nice in here, and it's not actually blowing anything up. So the American Clean Tone Stack is as was used before. The power amp, I used the Blues power amp as well. I did things a little interestingly, that I switched out the 6L6 power tube for a 6V6, which is like some of the smaller Fender amps, and kept it in push-pull mode. Started with one of these smooth dynamic presets, and then, yeah, so it's power filtering. You can change the capacitor module and all sorts of clever stuff. Then there's the transformer, which I use the dynamic tone to make it less brittle. And then the cabinet is one of the new Celestion cabs, which I've used on pretty much everything. This is the Alnico Blue. And it's got the Royal Ribbon and a 57. If I switch that out for one of the older 2x12 models, let's say what have we got that's Fendery? Black Duo. So The way that Positive Grid have captured this, it's not got much high end, it's quite almost muffly. If I switch back to the Celestion, what? There we go. So that's a much more, to me, much more forward, much more open sound. Let's look at the bass as well, because as soon as we pulled up the bass, it's an entirely new bass model. So this was, let's just look at this. This is the, it looks a lot like an Ampeg SVT, one from the late 60s, early 70s. And it sounds great. So I'm running this through a Slate virtual tape machine, which doesn't do much apart from add a little warmth. Running a little compression, taking a little bit of the really low mids out, like a little bit, and using Slate's virtual mix bus. So let's just... You see how little compression I'm using? In fact, I'll turn those off for the purposes of this video. Again, that is exactly what I would do with a real bass amp. I would generally have a light compression. And generally, if I'm using a light compression on a bass amp, that means that it's doing its job right. For me, you shouldn't have to really compress a bass amp to death unless something's gone horribly wrong. So... So the bass preamp has a 4-band EQ, so it's low, low, mid, high, mid, and high, which is much more useful to me for bass than just having a single mid control. I think I changed the tube stage to a 12BH7 again there, which just sounded pleasing to my ears. So the gain and distortion levels are separate knobs, which is great for bass, because it means that you can design an amp that's got kind of that blooming gain thing without too much gritty distortion. And I imagine the blend... The blend doesn't seem to do very much right now, but I imagine it's a blend of the original signal. So then I've got the bass blue line tone stack. So the power amp is the bass model as well. Now that's in all the different configurations. So I've gone for push-pull. 6550 is a new tube type, and that is the classic Ampeg SVT. They use 6550s. Apparently they're powerful enough to kill a man, but that's in virtual world not a problem. So there's then the master volume. There's a headroom knob, which is great for bass, because if I take the amount of headroom down, I could have a smoother bass tone, or I could have a much cleaner sound. There's a contour on the power amp section, which of course on a real amp you might have, you might not. Which goes from a very vintage mid-focus to a very modern mid-scoop. There's a presence which can be switched between vintage and modern, which I think shifts where that presence peak is. In this case I stuck with the vintage because I wanted the design to be like an old vintage Ampeg, but you can make it much more modern sounded. And there's a pushed resonance which will make the cabinet thump more. I used the dynamic tone again with a fat transformer just to make it like a big fat bass amp with a big fat transformer. This is the one time on this mix I didn't use the Celestion cabinets, because there are currently no Celestion bass cabinets in there, but I used the Bass Super, which is the SVT 8x10, the fridge as everybody calls it, with the 421 microphone in front of it, which is what I would put on a real bass amp. And now let's look at the big tamale, which is our big heavy tones. So if I just solo that. So on the mix rack, I've got a tiny bit of compression and saturation, and quite a lot of top and mid boost. Again, what I would do with a real guitar amp, because if you push the treble on a real guitar amp, it just gets nasty, whereas if you do it with the desk EQ afterwards, it's more of a kind of pleasant, sweet thing. You can see how the compressor's not doing anything apart from on those really heavy chug-chug bits as well, which is kind of how I would want it to be. It just helps to bring that to the forefront. So let's look at one of these amps. So I named it Mark II C+ Celestion Tones, and let's have a look inside. So this is largely the same as Bias Amp 1. So the preamp section is all fairly standard, as is the tone stack. So what's new that I've used here? The dynamic tone, definitely. If I roll that off and then roll it back in, you'll hear as I roll a dynamic tone off and back in that it sounds quite kind of brittle and MIDI, and then I roll a dynamic tone back up and suddenly it becomes kind of bigger. Let's just solo one of these in mono. I just find that as I was sweeping that, you can hear a kind of thing. Somewhere in the middle, I find that because it's a dynamic EQ, it helps to just sit the guitar in the mix better. And then we come to what I consider the pièce de résistance, which is the Celestion cabinet. The Vintage 30 and the 4x12 sound so much better than the older versions of Bias. If I switch this out for a 4x12 Vintage 30 from the original stuff, 4x12 tread plate, which will have had Vintage 30s in it. And then back to the Celestion version. I'll hit play, then I'll change it. Listen. Seems to load it in a kind of a two-stage thing, but once it's loaded there, that's so much better. And when we have that in stereo, and there's a bit of an EQ on the post here just to give it a bit of a more modern scoop, but as you can see, it's barely a decibel here, a decibel there. And that combined with the bus is most of the sound. Something that's really interesting to me is I'll turn the volume up on this group now, and I'm going to play it from just before that clean section, because the clean section I was going to use clean amps, but instead I rolled the volume off and found that this is what it sounds like on my neck pickup when I turn off the Tube Screamer on the same high gain tone. Honestly, same tone. Yeah, that's that same heavy gain tone. As soon as this changes, listen. How different is that on the same tone? This is something that older amp sims just got wrong, that just couldn't do. Where they would try and emulate a high gain sound, but just that, whereas because they've emulated this component for component, you can roll your volume off and do that. And on the other side, so on the right hand channel, let's just have a listen to that. So that's, I left the Tube Screamer on that side. And you can hear quite a bit of kind of hissing and noise, because I left the Tube Screamer on even with the volume rolled off. That's going to happen. But these two together, just liked that tone, but because the volume was rolled back on both channels, it gives me a very different sound, which I'll hit play again from this clean part to this heavy part, same amp channels. That difference is absolutely night and day. So last thing, let's have a look at one of these solo channels, because these were starting to feed back through the monitor speakers right here. These were so high gain. I did have a compressor running after the amp, and in fact this is exactly the same amp setup as before. I just had the gain a little higher and then compressed afterwards. That's the other thing that I did that I'd forgotten, is the tubes in these power stages are all EL34s. I just decided whilst flicking through them that I preferred the sound of that one, and with a real tube amp you can't just flick through them like that. You have to change the bias, you have to buy the tubes, you have to listen. That might just work well in the mix. So let's try this in the mix with the KT88s. I'll consider it. I mean, it sounds pretty decent to me. KT88s are the kind of tube where if you basically don't want power amp distortion at all, but you want volume, that's what you go for. I mean, some amps can be modified to work with that, or designed with that in mind. But it's, yeah, the kinkless tetrode, they're called, KT88s. They are some seriously high power valves. And then, yeah, you can, again, I used the vintage 30 Celestion models. If I remember rightly, on the right hand channel of each guitar speaker, yeah, that's right, I used greenbacks. So I used greenbacks on the right and vintage 30s on the left to make it sound even bigger, without having to go into an amp room and change the speakers or the mic positions over. So there's a lot that you can do here, a lot going on, and I am probably going to be using this on writing and demoing stuff when I'm not in the studio a lot. So back to me in the studio. So that concludes our in-depth poke around review kind of demo of Bias Amp 2. Hopefully it's shown you what you were looking for. I mean, one thing that we have to talk about is the price, because it's not the cheapest. And that's Positive Grid's pricing structure. It just is. The basic version is the $99 version. The Pro one is the one that I would probably recommend for a lot of people, because the new amp styles and the fact that you can load in your own impulse responses and all that kind of thing is really the stuff that stands it apart from the first version. And then the Elite pack with the Celestion cabinets. I can't say enough good things about the Celestion cabs. I've been using them for as long as even the kind of static impulses from Celestion have been available. And they've replaced any other impulse that I use outside of 2Note's Wall of Sound, which you may well know I make my own cabs for, and I use that fairly exclusively because I like the sound of my own cabs. Why would I not? Why would I, I bought them. But that's a different thing. If you're just looking for a tone that comes in the box and is relatively simple to use, I've got to recommend it. So that is that. Thanks for watching. I'm Adam Steele for the Hot Pulse Studios. Give us a like if you found this useful. Subscribe to the channel for more reviews, tutorials, monthly and weekly guitar and tech news, and stick around for the next video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon. Goodbye. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this, feel free to check out our other videos, as you can find here, or check out our Facebook and Twitter, or our Patreon page, which helps us to make more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.